Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to another segment here on Project Purpose. For those of you who are new, we cover topics that relate to mental health, mental wellness, and education on a week by week basis. And today's topic of discussion is education. On the conversation on education, I want to talk about values and mission statements. I want to talk about those things and how to evaluate how far the actual culture measures against the ideal. And so any environment that you step into, whether it's a school, so this is whether you're starting a new high school, starting a new university, whether this is in your career, whether this is a club or a social or an association, a lot of communities are established or try to establish themselves around a standard of excellence or a code of conduct. And so ever since I was young, I told you, like, I was raised in one of many communities, whether that was a religious community, whether it was sporting related, whether it was schooling. Like, I understood that there was always Kool-Aid that I needed to drink. I always had to kind of align to the culture. And so I am someone who is very passionate about words. I'm very literal when it comes to words. And I understand that not everyone takes the words that they use very seriously. And because I am so intentional and mindful about the words that I use and that I choose to not only articulate my ideas, but even in the way that I want to present myself, I always assume the same for others, but it's not always the same, right? Like, sometimes people like to market themselves, right? Sometimes it's a gimmick. And if it is the case that you're stepping into an environment and you're sold in that environment because of the values, because of the mission statements, because of the way that they present themselves as a collective identity, then you want to just make sure that the ideal that they're presenting, and always, anytime a community is built itself across a set of ideals, when they try to identify themselves, what you want to know is, do they really align or uphold themselves to that standard? Like, are they really, the way that they're organized, try to emulate that standard? And not every entity that says that they are a certain way or that they aim to be a certain way aims to emulate those specific characteristics or traits or values. And I don't think that we're all ever going to find that ideal actually materialize. Like, this isn't the Stepford Wives. Like, we're not living in some alternate reality where we're all perfect, we can all really behave that well all the time. But you just want to make sure that whatever word someone chooses to identify themselves, to identify the community that you're contemplating joining, that identify, like, even the company that you contemplate joining, that you want to make sure that their practices align to that standard, right? And so that's what I want to come here and talk about, because when I first entered the job market, I had been primed essentially with the communities that I had grown up in, that it was really a living standard, right? So my experience as a child, like going through different clubs and associations, and I was that kid who was part of a lot of different things. So I was part of different teams within my school. I did cheerleading. I tried to join the badminton team. I joined the basketball team. Like, I was pretty active. I also did horseback riding growing up. There was a set of standards that I had to align to. Even when I played instruments, there was a standard that I had to align to. I went to a lot of different schools, and some of them were religious schools, some of them weren't. And each of them had like a standard. They had like a code of conduct or a standard that they articulated that we had to like think about every morning. We had to reflect on. We had to reflect on what kinds of behaviors that we would need to exhibit, what kind of choices we would need to make in order to live that standard. And again, like, I grew up in a very strictly religious environment. And even within that religion, like, there were different clubs and associations that I could join. And one of them was Pathfinders, which is kind of like the religious version of Brownies or Boy Scouts. And my parents also tried to put me in 4-H and all of these. Before you could really immerse yourself in the activities that these communities engage in, you had to understand the philosophy that they abided by. And up until I was hitting adulthood, up until university, there was almost a lockstep. Like, these communities, these groups, these like social that I was part of, like, they really lived and breathed that standard. Their rules of engagement aligned to that standard. The choices that they expected me to make aligned to that standard. The way I was disciplined aligned to that standard. Like, there was a cohesion between who they said they were and how that translated by way of how I needed to behave. And there was also accountability, right? They held themselves accountable to their own standards, and they held me accountable to that standard. And I never really saw a gap, right? And so when I started as an adult assessing and evaluating different communities, the different companies that I wanted to aligned to, I really took those mission statements and those values very seriously, only to realize that as you get older, sometimes it's not a living, breathing standard. And so my 20s is really me understanding that not everything that people say that they are, they actually are. And there are different ways that you can evaluate whether or not a company or a club or a community really is trying to at least adhere to that standard or aiming for that standard, or if they're just saying it, but there's absolutely no cohesion by way of how they're organized against that standard, right? Because what you don't want is to have yourself invest emotionally, mentally, psychologically, in whatever ways, or even sometimes financially, in joining a community in a group because you really feel an affinity with those standards, and then those standards don't themselves materialize, right? You see different ways that those standards are broken. And again, like, we don't live in a world of ideals, right? So when we think about mission statements, when we think about values, when we think about the ways that companies, people, clubs, associations, like how they present themselves as wanting to show up, like, you need to give a little bit of grace, because there's always going to be some friction points, like some areas that they need to improve or grow into to be able to show up that way. But there shouldn't be a massive gap, right? And it also should be a gap that people acknowledge that they're working towards. Like, it can't be that when you realize, like, hey, like, there's a lot of things that for me create a disconnect between who you say you are and who you actually are. If they're looking at you like you're naive and foolish for thinking that they actually live to that standard, that probably isn't the environment that you want to find yourself into, right? And so for me, like, I used to take mission statements very seriously. Like, when I used to do my research when it came to the different clubs that I wanted to join as an adult, the different extracurricular activities that I wanted to do, or the different companies that I was like entertaining or wanted to potentially hire into, I would look at these mission statements as law. Like, I thought that, if this is who you say you are, then this is actually what I will experience going into those entities or going into those environments. And it's not always the case. So you want to make sure that if it is the case that a company, a group, a collective, or even a person, like, this comes down to even at a person level, that someone is not BSing you, then you want to just make sure that they walk the walk that they speak, right? Like, they walk the walk that they talk. And so there's different ways that this materializes. And so for me, like, when someone tells me who they are and I see consistently gaps in how that translates in their actions, then I trust the actions over the words. And I think that all of us should kind of develop that principle that anyone can say that they are anything, right? Like, talk is cheap at the end of the day. And whether that, and then again, this isn't just targeting a specific area of life, right? Like, talk is cheap whether someone is selling themselves to you as a friend, as someone that you want to get into a relationship. Talk is cheap if it comes to like a club or association or religious group, a company, like any entity that you think about aligning yourself to. Like, you're first going to evaluate those value propositions or those mission statements. And so what you want to see before you fully engage yourself is if whether or not recourse is aligned to that statement, to those mission statements, to those values, so on and so forth. And so I remember when I was starting out my career in my 20s, like, I used to always call out the gap, right? Like, I was the person who was like, well, if we say we are this, then if we're confronted with this situation, then that gives us this very narrow sort of scope of reference from which to make decisions, because we're making decisions in alignment with this identity. And if we're trying to make decisions aligning to this standard and aligning to this identity, then these are the types of decisions that we should be making. And it was interesting how a lot of people didn't really build that bridge, right? They didn't think that, oh, wait, just because our mission statement said this means that these are the ways that we engage or manage or react or respond in these specific settings. They didn't understand how to bring or breathe your values and your mission statements to life. And that's fine if you don't understand it, because sometimes, you are inheriting values and mission statements and beliefs that have been passed on, and different people find that the actions that align to different values and beliefs translate differently. But you want to always have like active participation, like the active critical thinking, and how do we make sure that we live these values, that we live these mission statements, that we are always trying to at least adhere or attain the ideal. And I am someone who is very keen on observing that, right? And I think, like, if you're in a company, hiring, firing, managing talent, it has to align with those values, or you see that there is active effort or concerted effort in making an attempt to align to those values as well. And that for me is really a key contributor to my level of engagement and my level of commitment to any setting that I find myself in. I want to know that the things that you say in any vein, like whether I'm looking at a person, whether I'm looking at an association, a club, whatever, that your actions align to that. And I want to know that you're making the effort. So even if there is a gap, and there's always a gap because reality and ideal, there's always a gap between the reality and the ideal, that there's actions towards trying to make that gap a little bit smaller. And I think sometimes we allow ourselves to be disillusioned. So we find ourselves feeling a little bit deflated, a little bit discouraged when we find ourselves in settings where we were really attracted to the way that they presented themselves or their identity or, whatever, but then we're finding that the reality isn't necessarily the case. But I don't think that that's necessarily a reason to completely drop off or completely like disengage. I think sometimes like you need to think to yourself, well, are they making the effort to bridge the gap? And I think that that's just the thing that we don't think about often enough. Like sometimes we think that things are very black and white when it comes to the ideal and the reality and the difference between the two. But I think that it's okay to strive towards an ideal. But given that we're all imperfect, like we can't always assume that we're all in a position to reflect and to behave and to have our actions aligned to that ideal 100% of the time. As long as you do see an effort of those ideals trying to manifest in like the day to day, then forgive the gaps, right? Forgive the gaps and sort of be part of how we make those gaps a little bit smaller within any of those facets that you find yourself in, right? And I think that culture is one of those things that evolves with the different people who are there to interpret it. And I think that culture is not this static thing, it's this thing that shifts and breathes and lives with every person who sort of contributes or who is part of that culture. And even how you yourself are choosing to engage, you contribute to the culture in that way. I think it was very easy for me growing up to subscribe to specific cultures because the rules of engagement were so prescriptive that I knew exactly like what things I should do and shouldn't do to be able to say that, hey, my identity can extend into this specific association, club, group, community, so on and so forth. But I think as you get older and when you find yourself in settings that give room for agency, and you want to find settings that give room for agency where people can figure out different ways that ideal translates in reality, then there's nuance, there's ambiguity because it's not prescriptive. Like you yourself have to consider, well, how do I make sure my own personal choices align to this mission statement, to this value, right? Like how do I make sure that the way that I show up, I'm not just showing up with the values and the mission statements that bring my own personal identity to life? How do I build the bridge between like who I am and the experiences that have shaped me, and how do I in this specific setting like align to the types of decisions that this mission is saying that I should adhere to when I am representing this entity, right? And it's not always going to be prescriptive. And I think when we're young, when we're children, it's much easier to follow a script and to follow rules of engagement. But I think as we're older, if we are the ones who are responsible for bringing that value, those mission statements to life, then we have to hold ourselves accountable to all of the different ways that that translates in our own decision making, right? And I think sometimes we think of values and mission statements that are indicative of the environments that we find ourselves in as apart from us. Like we think that everyone around us is supposed to exhibit these values and these behaviors except for us. Like we're still sort of on the outside observing, critiquing, evaluating to what extent does everyone else adhere to these values and mission statements, while ourselves, we're not holding ourselves accountable to them, right? So I think that the best way to find cohesion is to also hold yourself accountable to it, right? And I used to be someone who, again, like was very literal about values and mission statements and propositions, like value propositions, whether it was someone who was telling me who they were, whether it was a club or association, like there was always like a set of ideals or standards that these groups or individuals would hold themselves against, and even companies, right? And I had started off in a very mature, very well-established company, and they made sure that like whether it was hiring, managing talent, or even letting talent go, like everything really adhered and aligned to those values and to those mission statements. It was something that they were very intentional about. And I think that when you find yourself in different settings that have different degrees of maturity, then you find different levels of proficiency in even how those collective groups articulate their alignment to those mission statements, right? And even myself, like I've created a mission statement for Project Purpose, and every day I'm trying to figure out like how do I make sure that the messages that I come here and share are aligned to those values and to those ideals? How do I make sure that the content that I share aligns to those values and to those ideals, while also making sure that I make room for my own personal identity as well, because I want to make sure that I'm not squeezing out my own identity trying to live up to this ideal, which I think is kind of disingenuous, right? And I think that it's just so important that when we think about ideals, we recognize that it's the standard that we're hoping to adhere to, but that it's always growth and progress. There's always going to be like a gap between reality and the standard. As long as that gap is a gap that we find ourselves intentionally trying to make smaller, then we shouldn't judge the gap, because none of us are perfect. So the companies, the entities, the clubs, the associations, the groups that we find are trying to to adhere to this standard, we shouldn't hold them in contempt because they're not perfectly there. I mean, anything that is built from imperfect people is going to be imperfect in translation. So we give grace for those imperfections, right? And I think that's what I want to come in here and talk about for the companies that are making the effort, the groups, the associations that are making the effort, but then sometimes they fall off the wagon, like that's fine. But if you find that there's this massive disparity and no one cares, then of course that's a completely different story. But I don't think that a company, an entity, an association, or a person tries to sell themselves as something knowing that they're actually the opposite. I think that that's very deceptive. And I think very few people operate with that level of conscious deceptiveness, trying to trick you into sort of aligning and adhering. I mean, of course, there are some people, places, situations that are like that, but it's few and far between. And in all cases, you need to trust your better judgment, trust yourself to know that if it is the case that you're finding too many flags, too many indicators that would suggest that what this person is saying is absolutely not in line with their intentions, with their motivations, with what it is that they're hoping to accomplish. And of course, like, you manage your energy, your time, you manage your engagement with that understanding in mind. And so I just want to come in here and talk about, because I think sometimes we think about an ideal and we don't recognize how to position ourselves against an ideal. And I think anytime someone talks to you about who they aspire to be or who they think they are, you need to understand that they're talking within the chasm of ideal and reality, right? Like, they want to be, or they see themselves as being, or hope to become this version of themselves. But then you want to just bridge that gap with, well, what do you actually see on a day-to-day basis? Do you see the effort at the very least? And if you see the effort, then honor the effort, and then support the growth and the journey that I think is continuous in trying to align to the ideal. And I think about, like, even the company that I'm trying to build, and I see the ideal that I'm trying to build, and I recognize, like, well, where would the disparities be? Like, where would the gaps be, and what I need to manage and control so that the reality and the ideal weren't too far apart, right? And so that's a lot of intentional, reflective, and creative thinking that I want to see for any group, any entity, any person who has professed themselves to be something and every day is trying to bridge the gap between the standard that they hold themselves against and the reality of it, right? Because there's a standard, and the standard should always be something that we're reaching towards, and then the reality is just the areas where we're falling short and how we're trying to bridge the gap with those realities. And I think that that's fine. I think that that's how we grow through this life. That's how we evolve, is by establishing standards and ideals that are beyond our reach maybe, but that we're reaching towards, that we're happy to grow and we're happy to develop to be able to maintain or be able to attain them, right? And once we attain them, like, how do we push the needle? How do we hold ourselves accountable to greater standards or to greater expectations? How do we continuously grow and adapt and evolve in that sense? And so that's why I want to come on here and talk about, because I think sometimes we feel disillusioned. We feel like if something isn't completely the way that it is presented, then that means it's absolutely none of it at all. And I don't think that that's true. I think it's a little bit more gray than that. I think that we always need to practice better judgment. We need to think to ourselves, well, is there effort? Is there intention? Is there mindfulness? Are we actively seeing a certain level of commitment to making the standard a reality? And if we see that, then do we want to participate in that effort? And is there not some degree of purpose and meaning and fulfillment trying to bring that ideal to life, right? But just because that ideal isn't perfectly manifested in day-to-day activities and choices and decisions doesn't mean it necessarily is something that is a complete throwaway. And so that's what I want to come in here and talk about, because I think sometimes in my past, I used to be so big on ideals that if I saw a gap or if I saw a flaw in execution, then I thought that the ideal was completely garbage, when it really was just like perfectly imperfect, right? It was people trying to live to this ideal and then recognizing that there are still different things that they needed to do, that until those things were done, like, they would fall short of it. But then also seeing that there are some individuals, entities, groups that profess an ideal that they have absolutely no intention of trying to align to. And so that kind of deceptiveness I would completely stay clear of. But if you think that, this is a work in progress, like, they're trying to attain this ideal, they just haven't arrived there yet, then that's something I think is purpose worth building into, right? Purpose worth giving yourself the opportunity to align yourself to. Because I think that rather than always see ourselves on the outside looking in, we can think to ourselves, well, how do we participate in making this ideal a reality? So that's why I wanted to come on here, some food for thought for you. I think that it's an exercise in critical thinking when you need to practice your judgment around the people, places, and situations that you find yourself navigating around, and to what extent you want to commit your energy to. You want to make sure that there's at least some intention, some effort, some desire desire to align to the things that these people, places, and situations say that they are, whether that's a personal value proposition, whether that's a mission statement, whether that's a value statement or a value proposition. Like, I think see how people represent themselves in words, and then try to see if they are actively building the choices, the actions, the decisions that adhere to what they say that they are, right? And if they aren't, if they are really just trying to create sort of this facade that they are happy to be completely different behind, then at least you're doing the activity to know the difference, right? You're not just typecasting everything as fake or authentic. You're recognizing that even authentic effort involves a certain degree of fallibility, right? Like, nothing is fallible, no ideal is fallible, and there's always going to be a little bit of flaws in execution, and that's okay as long as the execution is really striving towards that ideal. So that's what I wanted to come in here and talk about. It's some food for thought for you. Now, if you are interested in cultivating the mastery to be able to derive fulfillment and meaning out of life, we do offer different programs on our website. We ask you to check them out, and these are really development programs that give you the opportunity to see life through a lens that gives you the sense of how you create alignment. We also do provide parent-child workshops, so workshops that provide leadership training for children. We don't think you can start too young, and these are built on 4 core concepts. So cultivating a sense of self-concept, of autonomy, self-efficacy, and compassion as 4 core pillars of leadership in children. And I think that this also builds and fuels into the programs that we have for adults as well. So something for you, something for everyone in your family. And I want you to talk about your experiences where you found yourself really finding an affinity with a mission statement, with a value, but then you saw that there was a bit of a break. There was a bit of a disconnect between what they said and what they were, but then you saw that there was really room for you to participate in bringing that ideal to life. Or maybe in the situation that you have, you saw that there was really just too big of a gap. There was really no room for you to participate. In all cases, I want to hear your story where you really did find yourself taken by a mission statement, by a value proposition, and then what happened from there. Thank you again so much for tuning in today and for listening on our talk around education, around developing the critical thinking around ideals and how we bridge the gap between ideal and reality without being too harsh and too critical. Because again, like, no one is perfect. So the entities, the groups, the communities that we build are not going to be perfect either, but it doesn't mean we completely find ourselves disillusioned and discouraged. We can always participate in building that shared reality and participating in that vision as well.